2020 has been an unexpected year. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a large impact on the day-to-day lives of people all around the world. With the closing of mosques, not being able to go to communal prayers, social distancing during Eid and Ramadan, and the suspension of pilgrimage, COVID-19 has required Muslims to find new ways to worship. By now, we are very aware of what can happen when large religious gatherings continue to be held in the middle of a disease outbreak. The case of patient 31 in South Korea is a key example. In late February 2020, South Korea had a surge in coronavirus cases. Thousands of people were infected, and they can all be traced back to one person, patient 31. It's not clear where patient 31 contracted the virus, but while she was infected, she attended 2 church services in the city of Daegu. By mid-March, 60% of all coronavirus cases in South Korea could be traced back to this one person because of the church services she attended. Because of this, we now know how quickly large gatherings can spread disease. But this is not the first time that religious gatherings and celebrations have been partially or fully halted in Islam's history. There have been natural disasters, wars, and yes, previous disease outbreaks that have impacted Muslim worship and forced Muslims to alter their way of life and their traditions in order to deal with these critical circumstances. Disease epidemics have broken out in the Middle East every few decades since the start of Islam's history. The first epidemic to strike the Muslim community was the plague of Amwas. This plague hit Syria, Iraq, and Egypt in the 7th century and killed more than 25,000 Muslims. It caused the price of goods to rise, and naturally, people started hoarding necessities. I guess we never learn. This epidemic struck the Middle East during the early formative period of Islamic civilization. Muslims of the time believed the Amwas plague was sent by God. If you were a faithful Muslim and you got the plague, that meant you would become a martyr. If you were a non-believer and you got the plague, then it was divine punishment. As a result, Muslims actually discouraged people from fleeing plague-stricken areas. If you were a true faithful Muslim, you should have nothing to worry about. Besides, there was no running from the plague if your death had already been decreed by God. In short, the response to the plague of Amwas was, as is stated in the Hadith, if you hear of an outbreak of plague in a land, do not enter it. But if the plague occurs in a land while you are already there, do not flee to escape it. This belief influenced the thinking of the early Muslim community and became the authoritative Islamic stance for many years afterward on what a Muslim should do in the event of a plague. For the next several centuries, plague returned to the Middle East every few years. The most famous, or perhaps I should say infamous, was the Black Death, which struck Europe in the Middle East in the 14th century. This pandemic was devastating, and some say it killed half the population of Europe. The Christian response to this plague was quite different from the Muslim response. The main difference was in how the two faiths viewed the origin of the plague. On the one hand, Christians viewed the Black Death as a punishment from God for their sins. This belief was circulated by the Church and is reflected in the European art and literature of the time. On the other hand, Muslims understood the Black Death much in the same way they had understood the plague of Amwas 700 years earlier. They shared the Christian belief that the plague was sent by God, but unlike Christians, Muslims did not believe the plague was a punishment from God in every case. If you were a faithful Muslim and had pleased God, dying from the plague was not a punishment, but made you a martyr. Muslims thought God sent the plague to chosen individuals, so they did not believe the plague was contagious. As a result, Muslims organized communal prayers in response to the plague, which included crowded processions through the cities and mass funerals in the mosques. Today we realize that such large gatherings would have only caused the disease to spread to more people. But at the time, Muslims did not believe that the disease could spread from person to person. They believed that God chose who got sick, and if you were chosen, no amount of social distancing could prevent you from getting sick. The perspective of most Muslims today is different. Earlier this year, we filmed a segment here on Let the Quran Speak on the question of whether the coronavirus was a punishment from God. Here's what Dr. Shabir had to say on this topic.
We cannot attribute things to God without any clear evidence. If people do not adhere to the teachings of God, then they can actually be visited with punishment from God. But then to say that a specific incident in our present world is due to God's doing, that can only be said in a very universal way, in the way that we attribute all things to God, whether good or bad. But to think of God like deliberately afflicting a certain person, this can go away from the side of justice towards cruelty and injustice from our part. If we start thinking of people who are sick, or okay, so this person is sick because this person did something wrong. But we should step away from that, or extrapolate from that to our present situation, and realize that there's a lot happening that we don't have the full understanding of, or all of the answers for. So if a person is sick, we shouldn't be thinking, oh, this person did something wrong and that's why this person is sick. Rather than blame the sick person or blame the victim, as we use that term, then we should rather pray for the persons who are afflicted and hope that God will bring about something good out of what is happening.
How has the Muslim response changed in more recent epidemics? We can look first to the cholera outbreak of the 19th century. Between 1830 and 1930, there were at least 27 outbreaks of cholera among pilgrims in Mecca. Hajj was suspended twice, in 1837 and 1846, due to these outbreaks. When the disease returned to Mecca in 1865, quarantine ports were set up at several locations throughout Saudi Arabia to help limit the spread of disease as pilgrims set out to perform Hajj. So, as history progresses, we see Muslims start taking deliberate action in order to limit the spread of disease. Let's jump ahead to the 21st century. The Ebola outbreak was reaching its peak in the early 2010s, and the world was scared that it would somehow make its way out of Africa. In 2014, Saudi Arabia temporarily stopped issuing Umrah and Hajj visas for citizens of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone to try to prevent Ebola from spreading to the rest of the world. So, as you can see, major epidemics are nothing new to the Muslim world. And this is not the first time that Muslim traditions like Hajj have had to be canceled for people's safety. But there has never been a pandemic quite like the one we're in now. In all these previous crises, Muslims have, for the most part, still managed to gather in groups during Ramadan, and were still committed to observe religious rituals together. It's not that COVID-19 is more deadly or more contagious than any other disease we've experienced in the past, so perhaps it has more to do with our shared social conscience. Because of how widely accessible information is today, most people, not just scientists, have a general understanding of the virus and how it spreads. We act more deliberately now because we know the direct consequences our actions can have. Though it is difficult, most of us are willing to temporarily sacrifice the communal aspect of religious and spiritual practices because we know that in the end, doing so will save people's lives. We can learn, both from the teachings and from the missteps of our past, to make positive, safer choices today.